Have you ever faced a choice where your heart said help them, but your mind screamed, walk away? A moment like that can change the rest of a man's life. This is not just the story of one lonely cowboy on a frozen frontier in 1882. It is also a reminder for us today that sometimes one step forward or one step back decides whether you remain alone or find a reason to keep living. If you believe in the turning points of fate, then listen closely to this story. And before we begin, make sure you let me know you are here with us. Leave a like, or tell us in the comments where you are listening from. Because what follows is not just history, it is a mirror of our own lives. The winter of 1882 settled over Texas like a heavy silence. The wind cut through the pine trees sharp as a knife. Frost shattered under every step along the dirt trail. Calder Vance pulled his coat tight, hands buried deep in his gloves, shoulders bent as if carrying the weight of memory itself. 5 years had passed since he buried his fiancée. Since then, he had turned away from towns, from laughter, from companionship of any kind. He built a small cabin of stone and timber with his own hands and chose to share his days with nothing but a mule, a couple of hens, and silence. That morning was no different. He was out checking traps, gathering firewood, expecting nothing new. But around a bend in the trail, he stopped. At first it looked like a pile of rags tossed aside by the wind. When he stepped closer, his breath caught. It was a woman, old and frail, her skin cracked, her hands swollen purple from the cold, her breath thin as smoke. Right then, Calder's solitude collided with something he had not faced in years, another life hanging by a thread. His mind told him what it always did: do not get involved. Do not take on burdens that are not yours. But her eyes stopped him. They were not begging, not afraid, just steady and proud. It left him unsettled, caught between the safety of walking away and the weight of knowing he would never forget if he did. Slowly, Calder pulled the saddle blanket from his mule and wrapped it around her shoulders. She did not resist. She hardly weighed more than a shadow when he lifted her. Step by step on that frozen road, Calder felt something stir inside him, a quiet unease breaking into the stillness he had carried for so long. And then came the words that shook him deeper. Near the edge of a small, broken settlement, the woman stopped, turned to face him, and spoke in a voice rough with cold. "I heard you want a wife. My daughter is perfect for you." Calder froze. Was it a plea, a trick, a desperate bargain? The certainty in her eyes told him it was none of those. A sharp whistle cut through the trees. From the shadows stepped a second figure, younger, barefoot, her dark hair braided with feathers, her dress torn to rags. She walked slowly, shoulders drawn tight against the cold, eyes watchful but weary. Calder's heart tightened. 3 lives stood at a crossroads. He, a man who thought he had buried every piece of his heart. The old woman, holding on to one last hope. And the girl, Sona, though he did not know her name yet, carrying the look of someone who had run out of safe places. For years, solitude had been Calder's armor, but now it pressed down like a chain. He wanted to turn away, to protect the fragile peace he had carved for himself. Yet his feet stayed rooted, for the first time in a long time. Calder Vance felt the truth. Silence was no longer shelter. It was prison, and before him stood the very choice that could break it. For a man who had grown used to solitude, bringing another breath of life into his home felt like placing his soul into the hands of fate. Calder knew this well. Even as he wrapped the blanket around the Apache woman and helped her to her feet, his insides twisted with conflict. Part of him whispered, "Do not bring them home," because that would mean opening the door to trouble. Yet another part, quieter but stronger, told him he had already stepped across the line of indifference. He had chosen to get involved. The road toward the cabin stretched under a thin layer of snow. With each step, Calder wrestled with questions. Who was this woman? Why would she lay the burden of her daughter on a stranger, and the girl? Sona, with her quiet eyes, what was hidden behind that calm face? Was it innocence cast aside, or calculation masked beneath silence Calder did not know? It was the not knowing that made him uneasy. The mule, Slate, walked slowly along the slope, tossing his head as if he too sensed the strangeness of the journey. Wind howled through the pines, carrying a long, hollow cry across the gray sky, making the silence among them heavier. The old woman leaned against Calder's arm, breath rasping, yet her gaze did not break. Behind them, Sona followed barefoot in the frost, her expression unreadable. Each time Calder glanced back, he caught a glimmer in her eyes, a steady flame of endurance that unsettled him, even as it drew him in. When they reached the ridge and the valley opened, the cabin appeared low roof, thin smoke rising from the chimney. It was the only place Calder had called his own. He had built it with blood and sweat, and for 5 winters it had kept him alive. Now, with one nod from a stranger, that fragile piece might no longer belong only to him. He pushed open the door, the hinge groaning, warmth spilling out from the fire. The old woman entered first, standing against the wooden wall, breathing deep as if the smoke itself gave life. The girl moved slowly toward the hearth, knelt down, and stretched her cracked hands toward the flames. No words, no tears, only the heavy sound of survival. Calder hung his coat on the peg, his eyes fixed on them. Doubt pressed against him. Were they hiding something? Were there others waiting in the dark, ready to strike as soon as he dropped his guard? Or were they nothing more than 2 exiles clinging to the last bit of warmth they could find? He did not know. The uncertainty gnawed at him. Still, habit and a sense of duty pushed him forward. He ladled out 2 bowls of rabbit stew and set them in their hands. The old woman ate slowly, carefully, as if preserving her dignity in each bite. Sona ate faster, but tried to mask her hunger. Calder sat at his corner chair, staring at the flames, ears tuned to every sound of their breathing. The small cabin, once a fortress of silence, now felt strangely unfamiliar, as if he was the outsider in his own home. Night came. The wind struck the windows. Calder pulled out spare bedding from the chest and spread it near the fire. "Sleep here," he said quietly. His voice sounded rough, but held a softness that surprised even him. The old woman nodded. Sona lowered her eyes. The glance she gave him, grateful, guarded, unsettled him again. He retreated to his own bed, lying on his back, eyes fixed on the ceiling beams. Yet his mind drifted to the 2 figures by the fire. Something thin but unbreakable stretched between him and them, a thread that tied him, whether he wished it or not. Doubt and responsibility tangled inside him, restless, unresolved. A cough broke the silence, sharp and dry from the old woman. Sona rose instantly, steady hands adjusting her blanket, guiding her to drink water. The motion was practiced, tender, as if she had carried that burden for years. Calder watched, and something heavy inside him eased for a moment. Perhaps responsibility was not a curse after all, but the proof that he was still human. Perhaps from the instant he opened that door, hesitation had no longer been his to choose. The next morning, when pale light slipped through the cracks of the wooden shutters, Calder was already awake. He was used to silence filling his cabin, but this time the silence felt different. It was no longer empty. It was filled with the steady breathing of 2 strangers. He sat up, felt the bite of the cold air on his skin, and thought to himself, "They are still here." A simple thought, yet enough to unsettle him. Sona had risen before him. She sat near the hearth, tending the embers so the fire would not die. Her dark hair fell loose over her shoulders, her eyes fixed on the glowing coals as if searching for peace there. When Calder stepped forward, she said nothing. She simply poured hot water into a tin cup and placed it on the table. No pleading words, no gesture of submission, just a natural act, as if she belonged where she was. Calder watched carefully. He had known people who came seeking help. They often brought soft words, sometimes lies, to win pity. Sona was different. She worked without being asked, She never overplayed her gratitude. She carried herself with a quiet dignity in the way she lifted her mother with arms that looked fragile but held firm, in the way her eyes met his directly, without bowing to weakness. By midday, Calder went outside to split wood. Sona followed with a small basket. He had not told her to come, yet she stooped to gather the smaller pieces, her hands reddening in the cold. Calder thought of stopping her, but he did not. He realized that stepping in would only deny the pride she was trying to preserve. So he let her work, the basket slowly filling in her hands. Back inside, he saw her sewing a torn edge of cloth with scraps of thread. Her stitching was slow but steady, without complaint. Beside her, the old woman rested, her expression softened by the presence of her daughter. Calder stood there for a while. Something inside him unexpectedly eased. He had grown used to seeing people give up when pressed too hard. But in Sona, he saw only endurance, only a quiet resistance to despair shown through the smallest of acts. Night fell. Wind rattled against the window. Firelight flickered across Sona's hands as she carefully tucked the blanket around her mother. Calder sat in his corner, watching. Doubt still lingered, but it no longer filled the whole of him. Something else began to take its place, trust. Faint but real. Not because she spoke words to convince him, but because she did not speak at all. Her silence and her actions were worth more than any promise. The next day, Sona asked to fetch water from the creek. Calder saw her small figure moving carefully over the icy ground. The pail clutched in her hands. He almost told her to stop. But then he noticed the set of her jaw, the determination in her step. She was not asking to be saved. She was asking to share the burden. Watching her, he felt something new take root, a seed of trust he had not allowed to grow in years. That evening, when they sat together over stew, Calder realized even the silence between them had changed. Silence was no longer a wall. It had become a language of its own, a quiet agreement. He no longer needed to ask whether they would leave. He no longer searched for hidden motives. Through steady actions, Sona had shown him that someone else could stand alongside him, even under the weight of hardship. The trust was small still, fragile, but it was there. And once it was there, Calder knew it could not be erased. That afternoon, the wind eased for a while. The sky, heavy with gray, showed only a few thin clouds, but the air remained sharp and cold. Calder sat on the porch, a small knife in hand, carving a piece of wood into the shape of a half-finished bird. Inside the cabin came the faint sounds of life, a bowl set on the table, the quiet steps of Sona. Since they had arrived, the house no longer held only the crackle of fire and the whistle of wind. It carried the weight of their presence. Sona stepped onto the porch with a damp cloth in her hands. She stood for a moment, gazing out at the frost-covered trees. Her face, earlier softened by firelight, now carried a deeper sadness. Calder glanced at her, then lowered his eyes back to the knife. He did not want to press her, but something in her expression looked heavy, like a burden waiting to be spoken. "Do you want to know why we are here?" she asked quietly. The blade slowed against the wood. Calder did not answer right away. He knew this was not really a question. It was the beginning of a confession. "They cast us out," Sona said, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "They said I was trouble. They said men looked at me and women hated me. They called me a curse, a shame." Her voice did not break, but each word struck the wooden porch like falling stones. Calder lifted his eyes. To him, she was no curse, only a young woman forced to carry wounds no one could see. "They beat me," she continued, tilting her shoulder to reveal a faint bruise across her collarbone. "They said I wanted the looks, that I asked for it. My mother defended me, but that only made it worse. They said she encouraged it. And then..." Her breath caught. Then we had nowhere left to go. Calder set the knife aside. His rough hands rested on his knees as he looked at her. In her eyes he saw pain carried too long, pain she had not been allowed to cry out, pain that clung to her like a shadow. "It was not your fault," he said slowly, his voice low and rough. "No one has the right to make you believe it was." Sona pressed her lips together. Perhaps she had waited for words like that her whole life but never heard them spoken. For a moment her expression shifted. Not quite relief, not quite trust, but an acknowledgement that at last someone believed her. Calder turned the small wooden bird in his hands, then held it out to her. "I have nothing much to give, but maybe you should keep this." She hesitated, then took it. Her thin fingers trembled slightly as they touched the crude carving. She looked up and met his eyes. In that instant, the caution dropped. The guardedness faded. What remained was simple and honest. The fragile thread of understanding between two people who never expected to share it. Calder turned away, staring at the trees, hiding the stirring in his chest. He knew then that his responsibility was no longer just food and shelter. It was the responsibility of a man who had seen another's pain and could not ignore it. That night, by the fire's glow, Calder watched Sona sit silently beside her mother, her hands clasped tight. Her eyes no longer carried only wariness, but also the faint glimmer of trust. Lying in his bed, listening to the storm outside, Calder realized something he had forgotten. He was no longer completely alone. He understood now that trust did not come from promises. It came in moments like these, when pain was shared, when empathy closed the distance between two hearts. And from that night, in the bitter winter of Texas, inside a small wooden cabin, a new bond began to form, born of suffering, strengthened by compassion, and quietly rooted in trust. In the days that followed, Ada's cough grew harsher. The dry, tearing sound filled the small cabin, breaking the nights into fragments. Calder sat by the fire, gripping the arms of his chair, listening to each labored breath of the aging woman. Sona never left her mother's side. She lifted pillows, tucked blankets, pressed warm cloths against her brow, every gesture careful and desperate, as if any pause might steal her away forever. One afternoon, Ada called Calder close. Her voice was barely more than a whisper, yet her eyes burned with the last strength she had. "You," she said, her frail hand trembling against his arm. "The girl is strong, but she does not yet know how to stop surviving and start living. When I am gone, let her not be alone." Calder froze. He was not a man of promises, but in that moment, staring into the hollow yet determined eyes of a mother about to leave this world, he could not turn away. He gave a single nod, heavier than any oath he had ever spoken. A faint smile touched Ada's lips, then her eyes closed. That night, Sona sat beside her, silent. Only the faint sound of muffled sobs shook her shoulders. Calder lowered himself next to her, his rough hand resting on her back. He spoke no words, but the weight of his presence said enough. Together they listened to the crackle of the fire and the howl of the wind, waiting, holding on. At dawn, silence fell like a heavy blanket. Ada lay still, her eyes shut, her face calm at last. Sona bent low, her forehead against the silver strands of her mother's hair, whispering words in her own tongue that Calder did not understand. But he understood their meaning. It was farewell. No wailing, no loud grief, only a stillness that cut deeper than any scream. Pain settled into the cabin like frost, not raging, but slow, seeping into the bone. Sona wiped her face, her eyes swollen but dry. She would not collapse. Calder saw it, and respect stirred within him. He went outside, took up a shovel. The earth was hard, but not yet frozen deep. Each strike was heavy, his breath fogging in the cold air, sweat dampening his back beneath his shirt. Sona stood nearby, her hands clasped tight, eyes never leaving him. She did not weep, but her silence told the depth of her loss. By midday, the grave was ready. Calder returned to the cabin, where Sona had wrapped her mother in clean deerskin, braided her hair neatly, her face softened into peace. Calder lifted her gently, more carefully than anything he had ever carried. Together they brought her to the edge of the woods, where pale sunlight touched the snow. There was no preacher, no prayers, only the wind, and the pounding of two hearts still living. Sona knelt, whispering in Apache, her voice so low it seemed only for her own ears. Calder stood behind, head bowed, hands gripping the shovel. As the earth covered the body, silence closed in around them both. When the last mound was pressed down, Sona remained, arms folded, eyes fixed on the grave. Calder placed a hand on her shoulder. She did not move away. No words were needed. Loss had bound them together. Pain shared was pain halved, and something unspoken passed between them. That evening, the cabin felt emptier than ever. The fire glowed, lighting Sona's face as she sat in Calder's old chair, hands wrapped around a cup of warm water. Her eyes were hollow, but not hopeless. Calder sat across from her, staring into the flames. In that quiet, it was clear they had lost one, but found each other. Grief did not vanish, but it became a thread that tied them. In sorrow. Calder and Sona were no longer strangers sharing a roof. They were two souls, each wounded, now leaning into the presence of the other. And in that loss, Calder's sense of duty deepened into something more, a bond forged in pain, sealed by compassion, and carried in silence. In the days after the burial, the cabin began to feel different. It was still the same low-roofed wooden house, with cold walls and the constant fire in the hearth, but it no longer sank under the weight of suffocating silence. In every breath, every footstep, Calder sensed something softer taking root. Sona remained quiet, but her quietness no longer felt like a shield against pain. Now it carried a rhythm of warmth, as though she was slowly reclaiming her place in the world. At first, their care for one another showed only in small gestures. When Calder returned from the woods with his coat damp from snow, he found a dry cloth already hanging by the door. When Sona built up the fire, the wood had already been chopped and stacked neatly by him. They did not speak of it, did not plan it. Yet these small acts repeated day by day, weaving an invisible thread between them. One evening, after supper, Calder cleared the bowls while Sona sat near the hearth, her eyes heavy with fatigue. For a moment he rested his hand lightly on her shoulder. It was a simple touch, but enough to make her lift her gaze. Their eyes met, and in that silence lay an unspoken truth. They were carrying the same emptiness, the same loss. From then on, small touches became natural, passing a bowl, hands brushing as they shared a tool, standing a little closer to the fire than before. Over time, trust deepened into something more. One night, Sona sat by her bed, her dark hair falling loose, her face lit softly by the fire. Calder, who once would have looked away, let his eyes linger. He saw the weariness in her gaze, but also her resolve, and above all, a longing to be trusted. When she turned and caught his stare, she did not retreat. Instead, she tilted her head slightly, as if admitting she no longer wished to keep the distance. Their first kiss came quietly, born not of sudden desire, but of a need for closeness. Sona stepped near, her hand brushing his arm, her breath trembling. Calder stood still, waiting. When her lips touched his cheek, warm, hesitant, his heart thudded as if it had not in years. He did not claim her, did not press further. He simply let the moment be. And in the nights that followed, when they sat in the glow of the fire, it happened again. From then on, their kisses no longer stopped at the cheek. Slowly, carefully, their lips found each other. Each kiss was tender, almost fragile, as if they feared breaking what had only just begun. Calder learned gentleness, not the grasp of a man taking possession, but the careful hands of someone given a gift he did not deserve to break. And Sona, each time she rested her forehead against his shoulder, felt another layer of her defenses fall away. The long winter nights outside roared with wind, but within the cabin their breaths mingled. Some nights, Sona drifted asleep with her head on his shoulder, her hand unconsciously seeking his. Other nights, they lay beneath one blanket, the simple closeness enough to keep the dark at bay. And then, in time, their closeness became deeper, physical. Yet even then, there was no rush, no claim of ownership. It was not about taking, but about choosing each other. Afterward, when the fire had burned low and only embers glowed, they lay in silence. Sona rested her hand over Calder's chest, steady on the rhythm of his heart. Calder's arm circled her back, holding her as if letting go would bring back the cold emptiness of before. In that moment, they both knew they had moved beyond pain, beyond doubt, into something else. Complete trust. The next morning, pale light crept through the cabin walls. Sona still lay against him, her hair spilled across his shoulder. Calder opened his eyes to the sight of her resting peacefully in his arms. For the first time in years, he began a day without feeling hollow, a day marked by someone's presence not as a burden, but as a necessity. And so, from small touches to gentle kisses, from quiet care to deeper closeness, their affection grew. It did not erupt like wildfire. It grew slow, steady, born of care and trust. Both of them knew this was not possession. It was a choice they had made together. Winter slowly slipped away. Snow on the cabin roof began to melt in droplets, and the path leading to the woods glistened with water. The harshest days had passed, and inside Calder something else was also beginning to thaw. He still rose early, checked his traps, split wood, and tended to slate. But now, when he returned, he no longer stepped into an empty house. There were footsteps other than his, the figure of a woman tending the fire or carrying water from the creek, a soft voice near the hearth. Sona was no longer a guest. She worked as if she had always belonged there, fixing the chicken coop when the wind tore loose boards, sweeping away the winter's dust, planting small herbs near the window. Each task was small, yet together they transformed the cabin into a home. More than once, Calder stood on the porch, watching her mend cloth or listening to her hum softly to herself. In those moments, he realized the house that had once been only a shelter was beginning to breathe like a family. One evening, after supper, Calder quietly opened an old wooden drawer. From it he pulled a worn little box, faded with years. Inside was a simple silver ring, smoothed by time. He had made it long ago, back when he still believed in a wedding that never came. For years he had not dared to touch it. Now, his hands trembled as he placed it in Sona's palm. "I have no ceremony, no vows," Calder said, his voice rough with feeling. "Only this. If you choose to stay, let it mean you never have to leave again." Sona lifted her gaze. In her eyes the firelight glimmered like water. She did not answer at once. Her fingers brushed the ring, as though absorbing the warmth from his hand still clinging to it. Slowly, she slid it onto her finger and gave a small nod. "I have already stayed," she whispered. There was no need for vows or witnesses. That single moment was enough. Both knew they had chosen each other freely and fully. Calder felt a weight he had carried for 5 years lift from his chest. And Sona, after so long being cast out and mistrusted, finally felt she belonged to a place, to a person. From then on, life was no longer only about survival, but about building together. They repaired the chicken coop, strengthened the fence, and cleared a patch of land near the creek for planting. Calder handled the heavier tasks, while Sona brought care and detail to every corner. Sometimes they worked in silence, but it was a silence rich with understanding, where each knew what the other needed without words. On some evenings, when the day's work was done, they sat on the porch watching the sun drop behind the ridge. Sona leaned her head against Calder's shoulder, his rough hand covering hers. The small cabin felt as warm as any grand house. In that quiet, they were no longer two survivors thrown together by chance, but a pair bound by shared loss and new hope. At night, Sona slept in Calder's arms, her sleep no longer weighed down by shadows, but softened by peace. Sometimes she whispered that she never thought she would live an ordinary life. Calder did not reply. He only held her closer. For him, happiness needed no words. It lived in simple things, an understanding glance, a hand held, a home filled with another's breath. Spring pushed forward. The creek ran clear. Green shoots rose from the softening ground. Together they prepared for planting. Watching her mark neat lines in the soil, Calder thought this was the beginning of a family, of a future he had once believed impossible. The silver ring on Sona's hand caught the new sunlight. It was not just worn metal. It was proof of their choice. No one else needed to hear it. But both knew the truth. From that day, neither of them was alone. They had found happiness in shared empathy, and together they had begun to build a home.